let's start this session. We are going to narrow down a bit the scope of the discussion compared to the previous session. Although the theme remains fairly broad, it's education, research, and innovation, and there is a footnote in the presentation that asks this simple question: is growth per se a worthwhile goal? I propose that we start narrow by focusing on education, which is important enough for us to have a good discussion on it. And if there are other interventions and we broaden the scope later on, that will be good too. So the two initial interventions are by Stefano Scarpetta, who is, everybody knows, Director for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs at the OECD, and Dalia Marin, Chair in International Economics in Munich. So Stefano goes first, and then Dalia.
Thank you, Jean. Also for sort of narrowing down a little bit the topic, although talking about education is as broad as you can possibly imagine. Let me try very briefly to make a few points on where Europe stands in terms of investing in skills. And here I think I want to focus on two things, the quantity, but also in particular the quality of education. But perhaps more important also to say a few words about the use of skills in the labor market. And actually I would like to start from that last point. I think there was a discussion today already about where we stand in Europe in terms of the labor market slack. As you know, the overall unemployment rate for the European Union is still not that far from the peak that was reached during the crisis, especially if you look at the euro area. I think I have to use the clause that Leszek Balcerowicz made this morning. You cannot talk about Europe when you look about many things, including labor market or education, because within Europe there are completely different stories. But if you look at the countries where unemployment has increased the most, these are the countries in which the labor market slack is actually very high, although there are some initial evidence that unemployment is declining from very high levels. I think, again, it was said, going beyond unemployment, you look at the youth unemployment, this is where much of the problem actually, in my view, lies, because you have two countries with unemployment rate above 50%, Greece and Spain. You have my country, Italy, with 44% youth unemployment. On average in Europe, we are talking about 23%. And I think this has been a very prolonged period of high level of unemployment, in particular, a very high period, long period of youth unemployment. If that's not enough, if you go beyond unemployment for young people, which is very much what you need to do when you look at the NEET, so those who are at the best unemployed, at the worst out of the labor market, but not reconnected with or connected with the world of education and training, then you're talking about a proportion that in Europe is around 13-14% of the entire cohort of young people in between 15 and 24 years of age. If you look at some of the southern European countries, you're talking about a figure which is above 20%. So you're talking about 1 in 5 young people in a number of European countries who at the best is unemployment, at the worst is actually out of the labor market or even looking for a job. So I think when we talk about education, use of skills, this huge significant labor market slack, which has become very persistent, I think is an important issue. This is an important issue because from all the literature we know about, what started to be a sort of cyclical increase in unemployment has all the potential to become a more structural problem of unemployment, especially when it affects the young people, which I don't have to remind you, is by far the most educated generation of people enter the labor market. And many of young people in a number of European countries never work, entered the labor market, became right away unemployed, and some of them have left the labor market altogether. The other big issue, in my view, is not only looking at unemployment or people outside the labor market because they are discouraged, but also the use of skills for those who actually happen to have a job or those who are regain employment. Again, very briefly here, when you look at the patterns of job losses and job creation in Europe, again, large differences across the board, you notice that in many countries, job losses were concentrated among those with fixed term, temporary, atypical, you name it, not open-ended contract. This is true in a number of European countries, in particular in the Southern European, but also in France and many other countries. Now, what has happened in the recovery in those countries that sort of enjoyed the recovery period and somewhat job creation? Much of job creation has been in terms of temporary fixed-term contract. The figures are in the order of 50% in Germany, 70% in Italy, in the Netherlands, in France, 80% in Spain. So a number of the job losses, but a number of jobs being created tend to be temporary fixed term, sometimes you can say precarious, but certainly not necessarily very stable jobs. Is it an issue? Maybe not, because a number of fixed-term temporary contracts are stepping stone into better jobs. Let's have a look at what happened to those on fixed-term contract. We have done work at OECD, longitudinal. We have followed people over time. What you observe is that in a number of European countries, coming to the labor market or getting a job through a fixed-term contract is not really a stepping stone. In France, 20% of those who were on a temporary contract at one point in time, 3 years later, are at the best on a temporary contract, at the worst are unemployed. However, in other countries, the stepping stone is much stronger because you're talking about 50% of those on a temporary contracts being on a more stable job later on. And this includes a number of European countries. Why it is an issue? Because when you look at statistics about how much firms, company employers invest in workers, depending on the type of contract you have, you see a staggering fact. You see that those on temporary contract, on average, receive about 20% less on-the-job training, and in some countries like France or Italy, you're talking about 25% less probability of being involved in on-the-job training. So you may put in place a vicious circle in which you start with a sort of flexible temporary contract, you hope that you're going to get in a better contract, but the company invests less on you, and therefore the probability of you staying in a fixed-term contract to actually going back into the unemployment, I think, increases. So we have a big issue, and again, there are huge differences across the board, in not only building the right skills, but making sure these skills are used. And I think one of the big problems we are facing, which is not entirely related to the crisis, in my view, is that we are not giving opportunity to many young people, not only the low-skilled young people, but a number of people with intermediate, if not relatively high level of skills, to use the skills they've used into the education system, into the labor market. Now, where do we stand in terms of investing in skills? Again, you are certainly familiar with 2 surveys. One is the PISA, which covers 70 countries. And again, if you look at the differences only within Europe, are pretty large, amazingly large. You're talking about the difference in the score, whether you're looking at mathematics, whether you're looking at literacy, when you're looking at science, of the order of 4 to 5 years of additional education. So the gaps across countries are that large. It means that some countries, de facto, for individuals of the same age, 15 years old, manage, in terms of actual competences, to give 4 or 5 years more education than other countries. Is that enough? No. Because I think what is perhaps more interesting is when you look at the variation within countries. And there the gaps is even larger. You're talking about maybe 5 to 6 years de facto of quality of education being provided. So I think, yes, there is a lot to be learned from some of the best performing European countries in terms of how to build quality of education, but I think there is a big agenda of each country looking at why there is this huge dispersion in educational outcomes within the country. This is not just regional. The differences are among different institutions, sometimes even in the same region, in the same area. So there's a lot to be learned within country of why some institutions are able to provide much better quality of education while others are really lagging behind. And again, it's not as simple as saying, for example, in the case of Italy, north is good, south is bad. It's not true. There are large variations within the same regions, which I think deserve a lot of attention. The same thing applies when you look at the competences, and this is the second survey I want to mention. It's called PIAC. So this is the adult skills survey. Here we are looking at competences of adults, 16 to 65 years old. It was done for the first time last year in 2013. It shows, again, huge differences within countries across individuals. Part of that is related to different generations. So young generations tend to be better skilled, more skilled than older generations. But actually, there are huge differences within the same generations. And I think a lot of that has to do precisely what I said before. It is whether or not people, in particular young people, were given the opportunity to use the skills they've learned in school. When you look at young people across European countries, you notice large. We're talking about 30 to 40% over-education. What does it mean? That people, young people in particular, have a level of education, formal education, that is higher than what the job they're performing actually requires them. Okay? Part of that has to do with the quality of that education. University degree is not the same. But part of that is because the labor market doesn't really give opportunity for them to use the skills they've used. But a big chunk of that is actually because a number of the overqualified are not overskilled, in the sense they don't necessarily have higher level of competence than what the job requires. They have higher level of education, formal education. And a significant part of that, when you look at the data carefully, is due to the fact that they have a mismatch in the field of study. they study on something for which there are not necessarily a lot of jobs. So when they enter the labor market, they end up working somewhere else. This might be a choice, but I think, in my view, calls for guidance on the choice of field of study, which cannot start when people choose the university, but in my view should start earlier on, when actually people make choices about more academic, technical, vocational education. Which brings me to the final point. I think Peter said before that we have this mass of people with low level of skill that enter into the labor market. Let him qualify that, and again, it's difficult to generalize. But I think a number of European countries, and the European Commission was somewhat involved into that, move into this idea of a knowledge society, which means that everyone should have a more academic degree, should reach university, because that's the only way to find a decent job into the labor market. If you look at the way in which the labor demand is evolving, it's actually polarized among those with high level of skills, but those with intermediate, low level of skills. And I think the big challenge is how you build also the intermediate skills, which tend to be vocational educational skills. So it's not by chance that Germany, Austria, Switzerland, the Nordic countries have a low level of unemployment despite having gone through a significant crisis. These are countries that have continued to invest significantly in high quality technical and vocational education. So the pathway into skills is not necessarily the academic path, of which many people actually follow. They don't really reach a university degree, but actually to combine academic education with high quality technical vocational education. And here the final point is that some of the countries with low level of unemployment is not just because of macroeconomic conditions, but also because they have a well-established apprenticeship and internship programs that really provide a pathway from school to work, and where actually companies invest a lot in the training of technical vocational education of the people that will eventually be hired by them. I think now many European countries, and we have been involved also at OECD about promoting, expanding, extending apprenticeship programs. I think in many countries this has not been very successful, to say the least. And I think one of the main reasons is not money, is actually because employers are not committed. They don't believe that by participating more actively into training and retraining and vocational education to apprenticeship program, they can get the kind of works they need. So I think this is a big agenda for many European countries in not only reinvesting in technical vocational education, but make sure that you have a close relationship between the education system, the employers, and the families themselves, so that this can be a pathway into the labor market. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. A lot we certainly will want to go back to. But first, Dalia, try to be as concise, if not more.
Okay, so my intervention is going to be a little bit speculative, since I'm going to talk about the rise of robots and what it implies for education policy. So in a famous book, I would like to focus on slides, please. In a famous book, which was called The Second Machine Age, the authors at MIT have documented a recent breakthrough in artificial intelligence, which have led to the emergence of technologies displacing medical diagnosticians, technologies that replace lawyers, Udacity, which is an online open course replacing professors, 3D printing, and so on. So the two hypotheses I want to discuss here is, the first is robots are going to bring manufacturing back to the rich countries because the machines are going to replace workers, and so the cost of labor is not going to matter much. That's the first hypothesis I want to look at. And the second hypothesis is that these brilliant technologies are going to replace smart people rather than increase the demand for skills. So what I'm suggesting here is that technological change is actually capital biased rather than skill biased. So let me come to the first hypothesis. The first hypothesis, there is some anecdotal evidence in the New York Times of Apple reshifting workers to the United States, and technology firms reshifting textile production from China to the United States. So the first question is, do we see something like that going on in the data? And here are the World Input-Output table that has been available since a couple of years now. And I look here at several countries, and what you see is basically it's a measure of offshoring is here that you measure the imported inputs on total inputs used in a sector. And what you see here basically is it's going up. And what you see in the financial crisis, there was some decline and people started to speculate, but there is a major rebound. These data go until 2011, so we don't see it in the data, but it might happening, but we don't have the data yet. So that's the first conclusion, we don't see this yet. There is no revival of manufacturing besides beyond anecdotal evidence. The second is, so far in the academic literature, we have been looking at skill bias technical change, and the idea is that technology and skills are complements. If that is the case, then the more technical change you have, the more there will be the more demand for skills. So what you would expect in a framework like that is that you will see a rise in the relative wage of the most educated people relative to the wage of the least educated people. So that's what we call the skill premium. Now let's look at data for the US and some European countries. I have here 3 levels of skill. The blue line gives the most tertiary education, which is basically post-college and above. And the red line is medium skills, which is basically high school education, and low skill is primary education. So what you see in the US is exactly what has been discussed in the literature, namely a spread between highly skilled people and low skilled people. But when you look at the other countries in Europe, you don't see it actually. You see it maybe since 2005 in Germany, but in all the other countries, the blue line is below, okay? So that means that when you actually calculate the skill premium for the high skill and the low skill people, you see in the US, you see it's slightly increasing. In Germany, you see it recently increasing, but in all the other European countries, they are actually declining, the skill premium. So the question is, why is this happening? Okay, so this is summing up. So why is this happening? So maybe the skill premium in Europe is declining because we have too much of education. Because we have too much investment in higher education. And the higher education is outpacing, the pace of higher education is outpacing the pace of technical change. So in a famous book by Goldin and Katz, they look in, this book came out in 2010, The Race Between Technology and Education. They show for the United States, actually, that when we saw the steep increase in the skill premium in the 1980s and 90s, the reason for that is because basically investment in higher education became into a standstill in the United States. And actually, when you look at it came to a standstill, while technological change was just moving on, right? So maybe something like the reverse is happening now in Europe. So let's look at tertiary education in Europe and the United States. This is what that slide shows. So when you look at these countries, you basically see that in Germany and the United States, Germany is a laggard in higher education. And Germany, the pace by which it was increasing is slow, as you can see from the graph. It's the blue, no, excuse me, it's the green line. Do I see this correctly? I'm not seeing so far.
At the bottom are
The US and Germany are at the bottom. And you see for France, France is something like 60, it increased by 60% in the last 15 years. And even more so, it doubled in the UK and in Italy. So in the last 15 years, there was a doubling in the share of people in the population with higher education. So my question is, are we fighting the wrong battle? So if it's capital rather than human capital that is going on here, if you have capital bias technical change rather than skill bias technical change, then these new machines, these brilliant machines, which are amazing. I mean, the way they are described here, and when you follow this in the newspaper, they are really making big advances now in learning, and even they can walk now, so they can even touch people now. So, so maybe they are going to replace us, the lawyers, the doctors, the professors, the journalists.
Not the least.
Pardon?
Not the politicians.
So, the economist, yes. So technology and skills are substitutes rather than complements. And we do have some evidence that this is actually going on. First of all, the declining skill premium that I just showed you. In a moment, I will show you some evidence on rising skill unemployment. And the most important evidence we have is actually that we see an increase in the capital share in GDP. So a global decline in the labor share in GDP. So that's the share of total income that goes to labor. It used to be the rule. It was 70 goes to labor and 30% goes to capital. And that has declined to 55 versus 45. And in an interesting paper by Karabourbonis and Niemann that has been just published in the CGEG, they show that this global decline in the labor share is actually due to lower prices for technology, and these lower prices for computers and technology explain 50% in the decline. And here I look at unemployment rates for workers with tertiary education. These are OECD data from Education at Glance in 2014. And what we see, for instance, for the United States, a country in which education was not outpacing too much, we see a doubling in the unemployment rate. I have to say, it's still true that the unemployment rate among educated people is half than that of the total population. But you do see a stark increase in the US, where probably technical change is moving up fast. And you see a stark increase in in Spain. You don't see, it's large in Italy, but it hasn't increased over time. You see a large, somewhat an increase in France. So there is something going on. So my last slide is what follows from this. So maybe the scarcity of education and talent may lie behind us. Maybe the future looks more like capital versus labor rather than skills. And so the policy conclusion is maybe we should not push for more and higher education. Maybe this is the wrong way to go because Europe has been advancing fast in this area. Another policy implication that came up when Joe Stiglitz was giving his talk is that the low cost of capital, because interest rates are very low. So maybe one has to think of, maybe you should subsidize employment in order to get rid of the distortion that Joe was talking about. Thank you.
Okay, super. Before I open the floor, maybe you could try to sort out the difference, because basically you agree on some of the facts, but you're providing two different explanations, right? Stefano has focused on the quality of education, saying that it was a mismatch between the education and the skills that are required in the economy that explains the potentially part of the low skill premium or the decline in the skill premium, whereas you're offering a different explanation based on technology. Why don't you perhaps, Stefano, why don't you react immediately to what Dalia said?
Very interesting presentation. My point is that, again, we are not talking about investing more in quantity education, but actually what kind of education are we actually investing on? I think a number of the figures, I guess, that we're referring to the wage premiums in terms of education, so level of education. So whether you have a tertiary upper secondary, and so on. The point I'm making is that within that, there are huge differences. When we look at the survey I was mentioning, the one on the actual competences of individual into the labor market, you find a wage premium, which is in the order of 60% if you look at someone at the higher end of the competence scale with someone at the lower end of the competence. This is a cross-section, so we don't have a time series, so I cannot tell you whether this is increasing or declining, but there is a large gap. So I think we have to be very careful not to invest any more in education because we have already made a lot of progress and the quantity of education, I think, has improved, which is true, but be very careful in what you are investing in. And I think it's not just more years of education per se, but what kind of education, what kind of skill, what kind of competences, what field of study. And I think the other, perhaps even bigger agenda, if I may say, is that we have to move away from the idea that first you invest in education, skills, then people enter into the labor market, and that's about it because they will find a job, and that will be fine. There is a much bigger agenda everywhere, including Europe, about what sometimes is called lifelong learning or continuous learning. In other words, there is no job that will last for the entire working period of a working life, and many people, everyone has to change job, and therefore there is a big agenda of allowing, giving the ability of people to continuously adapting their skills. I think the other part of the story is also that you have to find a way, and this has to be public-private, to encourage employers to invest in the human capital of their workers and find a partnership between public and private in which this idea of continuous learning can be put in practice. I don't know of a model or a country that does it. The Nordic countries certainly are much more advanced because they find all ways in which actually they subsidize on-the-job learning or period in which the worker outside the company actually improve their skills and so on and so forth. But in my view, that's a big agenda. It's not more quantity, but actually what it is that we are actually building, what kind of skills.
Dalia, a word of reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. In the past, it was that actually the biggest inequality in pay was within the same education level. That's what we saw in the last 10, 15 years. That's the issue that we talked about when we talk about the spread in between. So actually, within the firm, within the same education level, you found the biggest spread in inequality, actually. So I do agree that it has something to do with the quality. And maybe we should invest more in general skills rather than specific ones, because we don't know which one will be replaced.
Just one point, because I think it's very interesting what Dalia said. Maybe we are just replacing workers with machines, robots, and so on. And I think she provides a number of interesting evidence. Now, let me put it on the table, because it's one of my concerns. The period before the crisis was a period of high level of employment and huge increase in inequality. This is not a US story, it's across the board. Most countries saw one of the largest increase in income inequality, including Germany, Sweden, and so on and so forth. So, a skill-based technological progress, if labor was homogeneous, everybody, there would be less to work, right? But we will share the benefit of that among everyone. The problem is that labor is far from being homogeneous. So as consumers, we will benefit from a skill-based technological progress. The problem is that as workers, this is not the case, because some workers will lose their job, while others will actually see their pay and their career prospect improving. So we are facing potentially with a skill-based technological progress, a further widening of wage and income inequality, maybe up to a point, and there is growing evidence that this might be detrimental, not only for social cohesion or whatever you want to call it, but also even for economic growth per se. Because some worker will be out of the labor market with no chances to find a job or find only a very low paid job, having much higher level of competence and skills, while others will benefit from this more skill-based technological program. So I think when we look at the benefit and cost, we have to look at as consumers on the one hand, but also as workers, because I think the situation is quite different.
Now let's go to those who have asked for the floor. Jan.
All right, just no longer have the magic microphone here. So a couple of sort of questions in interpretation of this. So the point that unemployment is becoming maybe more structural and not cyclical, I think, is a serious one. But the question is, what's in a way driving it? Because if we go back and look, let's say 30 years back, and look at a big recession, the unemployment rates are not too dissimilar from what we see now, both for adults and for youth. So is it that the current recession being longer is maintaining that longer, and we are therefore seeing it as becoming structural. And is that just a hypothesis? And if we resume rapid growth, just like in the late 80s and so on, we'll come back to low unemployment in general. I'm ignoring country specifics like Germany, declining unemployment and so on, but general. So that's sort of a question of the day. Is there something new, or is it just the same thing and we just see, a bigger recession and longer recession, right? So then on the sort of mismatch in the field of study, I wonder if there's been actually a change in the behavior of firms. And here I'm hypothesizing in the sense that I remember when I graduated, companies would come to recruit, and they just went after the brain power. So poets and historians could be hired by Wall Street because they said, we'll just mold them. We just want the brightest, right? And my sense is that that's not happening now. That now sort of the cartoon from New Yorker is typical, where the two girls huddle under the ivory tower, and one of them says, so-and-so has a boyfriend that's English major, and the other one says, well, gee, his parents must be rich, right? So I think everybody's going after professional or semi-professional education because I think the firms maybe are behaving differently. If so, why? That's sort of the question I have here. And then I wonder about this over-investing in higher education, and Dalia's sort of good point coming from that, are we in some sense over-investing? And the question is, again, would it matter who bears the cost, right? So if in the US, let's say as an example, the individuals bear a lot of the cost, then it's consumption, right? And those who are the English majors are doing it as consumption, and you see lots of people going into more professional type of education. Is Europe different because the cost is borne by the state?
I'm a bit confused. I don't know what is exactly the issue we are discussing. Are we discussing the value of education or the value of education for employment? If we are discussing this latest point, I agree with both speech, even if they are a bit different as their conclusion. Your conclusions are despairing. I am very sad about that. Economics will disappear, which would not be a big problem. But doctors may disappear as well, which may be a bigger problem than that. But I am, even for that, I am not sure, because if we look at the US, which is a country characterized by such high degree of inequality, where you have 99% of a population whose income has increased 0.75 in 15 years per year, compared with the average, which was something like 1.4, you say it does not seem that there has been a strong demand for the qualified people, for skilled people. Otherwise, more than 1% will have become richer. So I'm not clear about that. The second point is from a perspective of well-being. Education is valuable per se. And generally in the education in particular, they are bringing benefit in terms of well-being. So are we just looking at one indicator, which is GDP, or are we looking at also the indicator which is more important for the people, well-being?
Well, a question to Stefano. How solid is really our insight into the content of education? I remember there are quite big fashion swings. About 10, 15 years ago, it was all we should go general skills, away from specific skills. Now the relatively good performance of Germany seems to swing in the other direction. So just how solid are we in a period when you say we should be forward-looking, adjust to structural change and so on? And the second point is on apprentice training. Coming from a country where this is quite usually seen as a good example here, I think it is in a period of crisis also in my country here, basically because one leg is fading away, which is the willingness of firms to provide the jobs. And it's understandable because I think the natural disincentive to train is that people move on. Yeah? There's a strong externality effect. And of course, in periods of strong structural shifts where you want to encourage mobility, this externality is more potent. Yeah? So I do agree that apprentice training would be a wonderful medium type of, or vocational training is very important, especially because of the most endangered segments of the labor force, giving some option of re-entry. Yeah? But as you said yourself, it's very difficult if you don't have the Meistersinger of Nuremberg tradition here to establish it from scratch and in the current conditions of very high mobility.
Extremely interesting issues which were raised. I have two questions. First, this is just for information. What do we know about the demand side for specific education, not just in general, but specific? Are there any comparative studies and studies over time? What about the information inputs? Where do they come from? What about decision-making process? That certainly students, families, parents, do we know anything about that? And second, at the supply side. To what extent does the supply side tries to forecast what would be the demand? What about the relative role of the public versus the private sector on the supply side? I think it's extremely interesting. And the second issue is about general versus specific. It was already raised, but assume for a moment that some general education is to be preferred. But what general education? Philology, philosophy, especially the speculative philosophy of the German type, mathematics, logic. What general is the best for your future career? Thank you.
Yes, I thought also it was very, very interesting. I mean, the issue of over-education that you both talked about. I must say that I also have a feeling that there is something there. I can't put exactly my finger on it, and I think I can't put my finger because at least until recently we didn't have the data, and that's why I'm so curious about the data that you, I don't know, you call it the PIA, or, you know, the PIAC. I haven't seen yet the data, I haven't seen it yet analyzed. But, I mean, I had also the hunch that in some countries, maybe this country, maybe Spain, maybe a number of other countries, where there was a very fast growth of cohorts going to university, it was maybe to the detriment of quality. And so, I mean, what I would like to know is whether, thanks to the new data, one can answer two questions, I mean, that have been raised in some manner. One is the value of general versus specialized systems. Okay, so, you know, in some countries, you get a bachelor degree, and not a bachelor degree in a field, you get a bachelor degree. Okay, you may have a major, but it's just a major. It's not really a specialization. It's not like in many countries where right from the first year of your bachelor, you have to specialize. So, you know, do we know something about that, the value of one of the other, in terms of what comes after that, in terms of job after that? The second one is what Jan was raising, depending, I mean, is there an issue about who bears the cost? So do we see that in different countries according to how there is a selection at entry or not? For instance, in Sweden, it's free education. It's free education, but it's not free entry. So you have countries where it's free entry and free education. You have countries where it's not free entry, but it's free education after the Swedish. Or you have countries where it's not free entry and it's high paying. I mean, you have all kinds of things. Do we know something about that? Again, in terms of then the choices that are made about the fields and about then the job acquisition afterwards.
I would just supplement, you also have the New Zealand system of deferred tuition, right? So you even could know in principle whether deferring tuition but paying it makes a difference.
Couple of remarks. First, before being too down on higher education, let's not forget that technological innovation in the last 50 years came mainly from the United States and from higher education environments. So maybe, as André suggested, is that we are not doing well the higher education in Europe rather than the level. And the second, much more limited on the vocational, you pointed out that there are many differences across countries in Europe. My casual observation is that one, the presence of German or Austrian multinationals helps vocational training in other places. And second, that unfortunately the Germanic influence in business does not translate to the unions. The unions at home are very, very puzzled by the fact that the German unions are not opposed to vocational education, because they are very opposed. Don't ask me why. So traveling, some traveling of German unions would not be bad to spread vocational training.
We have to be very careful with our resources. Okay. Gary Becker once said that the real competition in the world will be competition in tertiary, post-secondary education. And I think what we're debating here today has a lot to do with this. But I want to make a remark, and the topic is education and, thank you, and innovation. The center is really very well organized, and I have to say that. In the practical way, yes, because of the Czech influence, very good. Okay, so, and it says on innovation. What's the relationship to that? We all know this is in country with a lot of empirical studies, that there is a positive correlation between spending on R&D and spending on higher education to GDP growth on the way through innovation. And the question is really what has created growth or wealth or well-being, and this is the innovation part, and how through a market system. And what's the driving force? Entrepreneurs and risk-taking investors, based on the spending on R&D by government. Joe made the remark that the US government has spent a lot on the research, on the IT. I think we have to make a differentiation between the spending on research that is on invention and spending on the innovation. So spending on invention, I absolutely agree. This is to a huge extent being spent by the US government, that is turning money into knowledge. But the second part, the innovation part, is a very different business, turning knowledge into money. And that is what we're seeing in the US IT industry, actually venture capital spending in the US last year was 55 billion US. Private sector research is about 2% of GDP. That's you're adding up another 300 billion on that, and the government is about less than 200. So just to put this in the perspective. You mentioned the book of Leif Jarnd and McAfee on the second machine age. And he comes with this very nice notion that the last 30 years, that is since Neanderthal, he said life has been pretty boring. And it's only becoming actually in the last couple of 300 or 400 years. The interesting thing is in 1780 after Christ, the GDP per capita was about the same as 10,000 before Christ. So what happened then, and through what? Innovation. It's scientific knowledge, and we ended the phase where people thought everything which is known everything which can be known is known. And since then, we went into this. So actually, the innovation is the driving of whatever we have seen. Is there a role for governments? Yes, in the invention part, and again, in the education. But we're talking about a lot of about secondary or more practical related or university. I think what I haven't heard here today is, I think the most important thing is, and what all the Jim Hackman's studies showing now, is early childhood education in the first 1 to 3 years. And that is, basically you could say people who enter the primary school, decision has been 90% plus is being made. So it's very ridiculous what Germany does. They charge young parents who send their children into early childhood and kindergarten. They have to pay. But once they are 20 or 18 years old, they can go to university and don't pay any fee. So the really right thing would be exactly the opposite, to give them any chance to get challenged in the first years, meeting educated instructors, where the parents can't do that, where you have the parents who are well educated. I know it's a crucial debate, and it's not a PC debate, but it's a fact. They challenge the children, and Jim Hackman says that in the first 6 years, children who have been educated by the parents who are very well educated hear about 6 million words, and the other group of children hear 1.6 million words in the first 6 years. There's no way that they can catch up in primary school, and the gap will widening and not closing. So I think the focus has to be much more what it has on that. And the second observation is patents. I'm not going to have a discussion on whether patents or not is a good thing or not. More and more I have doubts about this. That's preventing and impeding innovation, because only 10 to 12% of all registered patents are commercially used. The bulk is not used. So you have these vulture funds who buy bunches of patents and go to block other people and sue them at the courts. And so there is more money now spent probably on that than on protecting patents. And these are going to protect patents which are not used by anybody. So it's not a good idea. But still, there is an interesting observation. If you look on the empirical, the numbers, and the average of the last 10 years, patent applications in South Korea were 1 patent per 235 members of the population. In Japan, it was 1 on 300. In the US, is 1 patent on 830 people. In Germany, 1,750 people. Interesting enough, in the south, in Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, is like 800. So it's like the US. So we don't have a north-south, we have a south-north problem in Germany. But now comes the hard part. Spain, 1 patent per 15,000. Greece, 1 patent per 20,300. Portugal, 1 patent for 31,400 people. And China is already 1 patent on 3,000. So if China would be EU member, it would be probably number 4 in Europe already in percentage of patents registered per in population. So where are we weak in Europe? It's on the R&D spending. It's particular on the innovation spending. On education, it was said. what is the innovation, financing of innovation? Financing of innovation is venture capital, basically. And venture capital spending in the US compared to Europe, and this is really amazing. And when we talked this morning about this infrastructure, I would direct, I think the biggest danger is that this is going to be a huge waste of money organized by an inefficient bureaucracy who is not able to manage the present public expenditure. Mind you, there's a very, very large thing, and that's my biggest concern on that. If you look at venture capital in the world, 75% of all venture capital in the world is invested in the United States. A per capita venture capital investment in the US is $150 per capita of the population, 2013 numbers. Israel, the real startup country in the world, is $250 per capita. Actually, the first half of this year, Israel jumped up into the league of $500 on an annualized base per capita of the population in venture capital. And now comes the hard part. The EU average is 12 US dollars compared to 150 in the US and 250 in Israel. The Eurozone is 5. And China, including Germany, it's very bad. And China is already 3 to 4 on the population. So Israel invests more venture capital than the UK, France, Germany, and Italy together. So obviously, and if you look on the NASDAQ, there are about 3 times as many Israeli companies listed on NASDAQ than EU companies. Now, it has a lot of reasons, but I think we much more have to look into these numbers because they basically tell us something about what's going to happen in 10 years and 15 and 20 years down the road. This venture capital investment in the 80s and the 90s in the US is what we now see in the IT. Joe is right. It wouldn't have been possible without the huge spending in research. But with the spending in research was accessible also for European entrepreneurs. But there was none, unless it were Asia or European entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, in an environment where 50% of startups are founded by people who were born abroad. Amazing, we assume we have that in Europe. And I think this is at the end of the 70s and the early 80s, all these firms who are now basically cornering or dominating the markets have been founded. And I think, therefore, I would really love to see a discussion in Europe on the 2 main issues is a lack of entrepreneurship culture and the financing of innovation. And rather in spending huge amount of money on infrastructure, which basically mean financing of old industry and structures, improving a bit more of the roads. Europe has a pretty good infrastructure, and I don't see where we should spend that much money.
I would just add one thing just to think of not just the points you mentioned, but maybe also whether the environment is friendly. Because the US venture capital is everywhere, and it ends up in the US and Israel more than elsewhere. It doesn't mean it doesn't look at Europe. It does look at Europe, okay? So it's not necessarily there is a lack of that. It may be that the other issues that are important, the environment, is what may have problems.
Okay, so this session was also about innovation, and we discussed a bit innovation. Let me go back to the 2 introducers. Maybe I have one question mostly for Stefano. I'm a bit nervous with this sort of advocacy of vocational training against the background of fairly segmented labor markets. Because if you have the combination of both, then you may end up in a situation where you're creating a lot of skill mismatch just because of your inability to foresee what will be the skill demand. And I'm speaking from a country where it is the case, and I'm a bit nervous about too much investment in the skills that are needed today, and perhaps not those that are needed for tomorrow.
Thank you. Let me maybe start from that point. I think the point I was trying to make is not that investing in high-quality technical vocational education is to respond to the demand in a segmented labor market. I would put on the table the argument that this is way in which the labor demand is evolving in different type of countries. In the US, which is a lesser segmented market, as well as in others. I think our economies are aging, certain technological progress is progressing rapidly, and I think, if anything, the labor demand will evolve with a high demand for high skill, but also significant demand for intermediate, lower level of skills in some areas, in the service sector as well as in manufacturing. The thing is not to think about technical and vocational education as a low quality investment in human capital, but actually, if you look again, the German and Swiss model, this is an investment that can lead to people continuing education and actually going to academic and university degrees. So there is a lot of fertilization back and forth, which I think it's important. Now, very quickly, because there were a number of very interesting questions, let me try to address them. Jan, about, are we really talking about unemployment becoming structural? That's a big question. I don't have the answer. If you look at the length of the crisis in a number of European countries, although we don't see that in the figures yet, we do have concerns about part of the unemployment becoming more structural. I didn't mention, but in Europe, you have half of the unemployed who have been out of the job for at least 1 year, if not more. And a number of them are actually young people, and a number of them are actually dropping out of the labor market. They can be reconnected. I know about 2 studies, one for the US, one for the UK, that look at the generation of young people entering the labor market during the first oil shock. 20 years later, these people had a significantly lower probability of being employed, or a significant probability of having a lower pay, controlling for education, and so on and so forth. So this failure to enter the labor market can have, especially for the young generation, I think, a long-lasting effect. Very quickly, because that's a huge point, I think what we have seen in a number of European countries is not just a demand crisis. This has led to significant structural changes. So a number of the jobs that are emerging now are not in the same sector, in the same occupation, as the job we have lost. You just have to think about construction sector in a number of European countries. This job will not be recovered anytime soon. Jean-Paul made a very important point. Are we talking about investing human capital for labor market outcomes, or in a much broader sense? And I fully agree with you. The investment in human capital goes beyond the outcomes in the labor market. My point is actually it's good to provide guidance to parents and especially to the students about what are the prospects of their own investment in education. Then it will be up to them to choose humanity versus STEM or other things. But I think the information set is not there in most of the countries. I think a lot can be done in that area. Now, is really the economy going to create more high-skilled jobs? You mentioned the significant increase in inequality with the top 1%. I think the story on inequality in the US about the top 1% goes way beyond the labor market. It has a lot to do with the development of the financial sector. It's actually not even the 1%, it's 0.1% that has really gone tremendous. So I think it goes beyond that. But I think, again, there is a lot of evidence in the US of polarization of labor demand between high skill and intermediate lower level of skills. Michael made a point is that what is the model done? And I think what I try to say, at least to put on the table for our discussion, I don't think you can just choose one model, the more academic versus the more technical vocational education. My point is that you need a combination. If our labor demand is evolving in a pretty complex way, actually require a variety of skills, you might want to invest both in academic, general education, but also having a good, high-quality technical vocational education. And I think the countries are doing better. Germany is not disinvesting in academic education by no means. It's actually investing in both. There's a huge stigma effect. In this country, my country, many European countries, if parents decide to send their child to technical vocational education, it's considered to be a failure. I want to be very blunt on that. How many of you would choose for your son, for your daughter, technical vocational education? In Germany, by no means, or in Switzerland, by no means, this is perceived to be a second best or failure in terms of, I think is a big point. Is apprenticeship the solution? By no means. There are a number of problems in Germany, in all the countries we're talking about. In my view, it doesn't work if you don't have high technical quality education. So if there's no trust on the employers that actually what they get, the students they're getting have high level of technical vocational education. But I think what is actually the problem is that many companies ask young people with high level education, but also with some work experience. Why do they learn the soft skills? Well, the apprenticeship offers a way to learn on the job as well as in the classroom. Right. In Italy, 10% of the 20 to 25 years old, while they're finishing their study, experience any work. Many of them, 90%, enter the labor market with no work experience whatsoever. And they also have the claim that they might find a job, which is not often the case.
Leave some questions to Dalia.
Yes. Why don't you go ahead?
Since you have answered most of the question, I wanted to say one good news from this story is actually that skills are becoming cheap. And when skills become cheap, that's good for research because the research costs. What's the cost of research? It's the hiring and the cost of a researcher, of a skilled person. When that becomes cheap, innovation is encouraged actually. So in some way, in a weird way, this is maybe encouraging innovation in Europe. But, and then the other thing is... Yes, yes. I wanted to add something to Jan as well. I think that the high rates of unemployment among the young is, in my opinion, a sign that there is something going on, so that graduates cannot get a job and they are replaced by a machine. So actually in the United States, since the financial crisis, there is a study that showed that actually the investment in machinery and equipment, in computer machinery, has increased by 25%. So this is part of the reason why you don't see any growth in jobs, is because there is an indication that there is something going on here. And that's true for the skilled versus the unskilled in the United States. It's just, Jean-Paul, do you want to live with a devaluation of higher education? So it's true that we should value education, and we all do, but we then have to live with the fact that we earn very little wages for it, you know? Because if it's plenty, that's what the market says. You are not going to have a higher wage for education anymore. If it's valuable, then you do it, but the price is you don't earn a decent income on education. That's the problem.
So you should, from the outset, have some part of the population which is not educated.
Yes.
For the rest to have some prospect of income.
Okay, let me close by apologizing to Mario because I said I would give him the floor and did not, and to Alessandra because I failed to see that she wanted to take the floor. I've been a terrible chair. Sorry.